Hello, and welcome to The Psychonaut Show with Dr. JKB. This is John K. Burton, MD, psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. And on this podcast, your captain on these voyages to explore strange new worlds in inner space. Our mission is to uncover knowledge that will ultimately make us more effective, more connected, and more attractive in our daily lives. In this episode, we're going to explore the concept of optimal frustration. This concept comes from Heinz Kohut, who was one of the psychoanalysts that came in the generation directly after Freud. And later on, I'm going to tell you more about Heinz Kohut and the context in which his concepts came out. But let me tell you briefly and quickly what optimal frustration is. It is the idea that we need frustration, or what we might also call discomfort, to grow. That might seem obvious, like we're not growing if we don't have any kind of challenge. But in addition, optimal frustration also tells us that we need a certain amount of frustration or discomfort or challenge in order to grow. Not too little and not too much. Now that might sound like Goldilocks. Not too hot, not too cold, not too hard, not too soft, just right. But in fact, it's actually not about being just right. It's about being just the right amount of not quite right. So I want to give you a couple of examples to kind of show what we really mean by the right amount of not quite right. Here's an example of a young man who decided to drop out of college. Why? Because he felt like college wasn't doing anything for him. He thought his professors were kind of narrow-minded. He thought his parents were wasting their money. And he actually knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a writer. But when he dropped out of college, he was a little bit lost because he was breaking with the usual status quo. There wasn't really a clear path set for him, and he was struggling a little bit. And his father tried to give him some advice and said, you just need to get out there and do it. And this young man said to his father, you mean like sink or swim? And the father said, yes, exactly. That's what I'm talking about. And the son said back to his father, I think if I was in a sink or swim situation, I would just get out of the water. And you know what? He was right, because panic is not a motivator. This is what the idea of optimal frustration is telling us, that too much frustration, too much anxiety that leads into panic does not help us to grow. And in fact, neuroscience tells us the same thing now, 100 years later, after Freud, and not quite 100 years after Kohut. He was a little bit later, but nevertheless, it's great that the biological sciences can show that these concepts actually are valid. Traumatic responses occur in the lower parts of the brain, what's been called the reptilian brain, the brain that is responsible for survival, for fight or flight. And that part is very important to us because it has kept us alive. But it's also much more efficient. It overrides the cerebral cortex. It overrides the parts of the central nervous system that are responsible for memory, or what's called declarative memory as opposed to traumatic memory, and what is responsible for learning. So if we are in a sink or swim situation and we're really panicked, we're actually not going to be using the parts of our minds that we need to in order to meet the challenge and to grow from it. So on the flip side of optimal frustration, there's also such a thing as not enough frustration, or not enough discomfort, or not enough anxiety when meeting a challenge. Here's another example. A family I know has a rule that every semester, everyone in the family has to pick something, extracurricular activity outside of school, and they have to stick with it for the whole semester, whether they like it or not. And the goal here is to encourage commitment, to encourage finding something ultimately that you're interested in and that you want to do, that enriches you, that you feel feel a passion for, but also to not force the kids to do things over long periods of time that they don't really like, that they're not into. That would be too much frustration or discomfort, like we talked about in the previous example. So the parents are talking with the family, sitting down to dinner, about what they're going to do. And one of their kids, he was a 7-year-old boy, he didn't want to pick anything. He kind of just wanted to stay home and, play video games. And the parents said, no, that's not the rule. You have to pick something. So they went back and forth again, but ultimately he picked something and stuck with it for the semester. But the thing about this was the parents also picked an activity too, as role models to their kids. They really showed that they had skin in the game, which I think is very motivating and great for the kids. And the dad said that he was going to pick yoga. But the thing is that the dad already did yoga 3 times a week for quite a few years, and his kid called him out on it. And he said, but Daddy, you already like yoga, so that doesn't count. The kid was right. That's not optimal frustration. That's something that he was already comfortable with, that he liked doing. There was no frustration involved. So, he would do his yoga and he would get better at it, but it wasn't optimal frustration and there wasn't an opportunity for growth. So what the dad did is, to his credit, he said, you're right, I have to pick something else. Because if he didn't, how is he going to expect his kids to kind of get it and do the same thing? So the dad picked a foreign language. He doesn't particularly like learning foreign languages. He's not into that. So that was a great option for him. That was something that was going to cause him frustration and some discomfort, but not too much. And he was going to be able to grow and learn from that. And the whole family was as well. So you can see how the concept of optimal frustration is incredibly useful, particularly in situations that we find challenging, where we're faced with a problem that makes us uncomfortable or anxious, and we're not sure which direction to go in with it. It gives us guidance. Now, I would like to go back and tell you about Heinz Kohut a little bit more, the person who came up with the idea of optimal frustration and how it's useful to us. It has an important context that I think helps us to understand it and its place in psychoanalysis. So Freud and Kohut actually never met, although Kohut was a medical student in Vienna at the time that Freud was at the peak of his career when he was writing. There's actually a story in psychoanalytic circles that as Freud was in the train in Vienna in 1938, about to leave Vienna to escape the Nazis, Kohut was actually on the platform at the same time. And the story goes that Kohut and Freud caught one another's eyes as Freud was in the train. And as it pulled out of the station, they tipped their hats to one another, and then he was gone. That was the only interaction that they had. That story might be a little bit more mythological than real, but it does help kind of illustrate the role that Kohut played in the history of psychoanalysis, that he took Freud's ideas and adhered to them, but kind of went in a different direction with them as well. And in fact, Kohut ended up fleeing Vienna, went to Chicago rather than London. There in Chicago is where he developed his ideas that later became what was known as the School of Self-Psychology. And his idea really began around the concept of empathy. And we'll do an episode delving into empathy later on. But his idea was that empathy was an ingredient in the psychoanalytic experience that had not been emphasized theoretically by Freud. Freud himself, despite his reputation, could be a very empathetic, understanding person with his patients, but he was much more focused on his ideas and getting them out there. And Kohut was the one who really came back to empathy and said, this is important for a number of reasons. He developed this idea of empathic failure. This is something that in the course of our development, We inevitably have empathic failures. And he was talking about primarily between the child and the parent that create little hurts as we go along. But you can really apply the idea of empathic failure to all kinds of relationships or experiences. It's when you feel misunderstood, when the other isn't getting you, and it hurts. But the thing about empathic failures is that if they can be repaired, if the parent can recognize that they're not getting the child and the child is feeling uncomfortable, and then they make an attempt to reconnect, that is actually where growth occurs. And this is how that relates to optimal frustration. It's that these empathic failures create the frustration, but if we come back to them and we repair them, that's how we grow. They're actually necessary. They're not only inevitable, but they're necessary. Overall, Kohut was more interested in looking at how we develop self-esteem. And you could say that he switched the sort of mythological emphasis of Freud on Oedipus to the myth of Narcissus. And I would love to go into the story of Narcissus and all of the sort of layers that are important, but let's leave that for another time. I just kind of wanted to give you the historical concept of where this idea of optimal frustration comes out of and how important it is. So Heinz Kohut first put forward his ideas in a paper that is now somewhat famous called The Two Analyses of Mr. Z. Now, one of the things I love about psychoanalytic theory is that despite the fact that when you read it, it is almost in a language that is so abstract and academic, it's incomprehensible, every now and then they have these titles or names for things that just sound like they ought to be in a movie. And The Two Analyses of Mr. Z sounds like the title of some film noir thriller or something Hitchcock would have done or something. The myth behind that, or probably the truth, is that Kohut himself was the Mr. Z in question. And he talks about his first analysis that was very focused on the Oedipus, and later the second analysis where empathy was more emphasized and where he developed more of his theories. So this podcast is about using these psychoanalytic concepts on a practical level. But I love to go back into the history and the theory just to give you a little sense of the richness that this comes out of. And hopefully I don't go too much into that and lose the point that this has practical value. But it does, and I think with optimal frustration, we can really see that. Again, particularly when we're faced with challenges and trying to figure out what can we do about them to allow for optimal growth. And I talk about some very day-to-day examples of family trying to figure out how to help kids meet challenges, those kinds of things. But as I talked about in the Return of the Repressed episode, these concepts also have application, I think, on a large scale level, at least to give us guidance and to help us think and understand one another. Let me give you another example. A little while ago, I attended a panel on race and psychoanalysis. And the goal of this panel, too, was to see what psychoanalytic theory and clinical work could offer to discussions about race relations, racial tension that has become so important and prominent in our country today. One of the panelists, I thought, gave such a useful take on this. She is an African-American psychoanalyst and director of a local psychotherapy clinic. And what she talked about was that she observed that in discussions about race, people get very anxious and they immediately retreat. And she said, you can basically list the defenses that are going to come up in any discussion about race. I haven't talked about defenses yet, and I will in another podcast. But just to go ahead with that, she said, some people retreat to intellectualization. They say it's the economy, it's not race. Or they retreat to denial. I don't see race. Or they retreat to making generalizations. All cops are racist. But we do this kind of retreat into these stances because these discussions create anxiety, frustration, discomfort. And what her advice was, is she said, if we could just say, whenever we have an encounter dealing with racial tension, if we could just say to ourselves and to each other, this makes me uncomfortable. If we could just, I'm just going to say it again because it's so important. If we could just say, this makes me uncomfortable, and sit with that, then we would get a lot further in understanding one another and a lot further in our progress in race relations in this country. It's really one of the best applications of the concept of optimal frustration that I have come across. Okay, to wrap it up here, what is the take-home message? Optimal frustration tells us that when we're looking to grow, when we're looking to make progress, there is no one size fits all. It's not black and white. Don't look for the sink or swim idea. There is no objective standard. You have to look at your own subjective experience. That's the barometer. Our feelings and our experience in each particular situation is the data that guides us to growth and to progress. I use a gym metaphor a lot of the time, and it fits perfectly here. It's like if you go to the gym and you want to get stronger, you want to make a particular muscle stronger, and you lift a weight and the weight is too much, you're going to injure yourself. No growth there. But if the weight isn't enough, you're not doing anything. You're not going to grow. That's optimal frustration applied on a physical level, but it's the same thing. We need to find a balance that allows for the repair and the integration that leads to growth. It doesn't matter how much you pull back. There is no external judgment. As it says in the Tao, the journey of 1,000 leagues begins with a single step. You have to take the step, even if you don't want to. But that first step can be as small as it needs to be so that you keep going. This is Dr. JKB signing off. Since we are exploring together, you make the journey all the richer by subscribing to the show on iTunes. And even better, if you also leave a rating, it helps others to find us. If you have a story about how the concept in this episode helped you figure out something in your life, send it in, please. You can also find me on Facebook and Twitter at Psychonaut Show. Show notes are on the website, thepsychonautshow.com. And if you leave me a question, it may well be an inspiration for an upcoming episode. Until our next trip, judge nothing, question everything, and remember, there's always a reason. Bye for now. The Psychonaut Show was created and produced by yours truly, John Burton. Art and web design by Hunter Creative. Post-production and sound design by Julio Gonzalez of Zimmer Media. Zimmer Media can be found online at zimmer.co. That's Ximer.co.